The Sinner, where we look closely at Jorge Bergoglio's life before he became Pope. As we saw last week in episode 1, some of his fellow Argentinian Jesuits accuse him of being an arrogant and authoritarian leader in the 1980s and of not standing up to the military during the dictatorship. If so, what changed Bergoglio into the gentle, smiling, apparently collaborative Pope who is now appealing to a new generation of Catholics and wants to connect with everyone, particularly the poor and the marginalised? And will he be able to hold his troubled church together and reform it at the same time?
I miei fratelli cardinali sono andati a prenderlo quasi alla fine del mondo, ma siamo qui.
In just 2 years, the Pope from the ends of the earth has gone beyond the wildest dreams of those who elected him. He's turning the Church and its message upside down by igniting a new vision focused on the poor and excluded. But is his leadership also in danger of splitting the Church? Can Pope Francis succeed today where he failed as Provincial of the Jesuits? Can he hold the Church together and reform it at the same time? In 1992, by becoming Bishop of Buenos Aires, many Jesuits felt he had betrayed their tradition of not accepting high office in the Church.
I find it difficult because that's not what Jesuits should do. And so lots of people were very cross about it.
That there was something not only spiritual about this, but it was more like a project for personal power. When he could no longer get this power inside the Jesuits, he looked for it outside.
He must have had that interior battle to realize what it meant to become a bishop in Buenos Aires. It meant that he could become Pope. Now, he knew that he was capable of doing it, and he did it very well. His leadership style changed completely as he became bishop.
Queridos hermanos y hermanas, Buenos Aires necesita llorar. Buenos Aires no ha llorado lo suficiente.
He had been, as Jesuit leader, divisive, authoritarian, arrogant, and when he left Cordoba, he was gentle, consultative, listening, participative, collegial.
Bergoglio chose not to live in the bishop's palace, but in a simple apartment beside the cathedral. Though he lived in the center of Buenos Aires, he made a conscious decision to side with those living in the slums and on the margins.
He did things that were striking that bishops normally didn't do, with all that he gave to the slums, to the poor, and the support he gave to the priests in the slums.
Ella lo conoció a Bergoglio.
Yo canto, gracias su santidad. Gracias su santidad por visitar mi país. La quiero mucho, lo extraño. Yo, viste que la quiero mucho.
Nosotros, el Papa, es como uno.
The Pope is like one of us. He came here to have lunch with us. The big bishops from other places wouldn't set foot here. This man did. This man is humble.
When Bergoglio became Archbishop of Buenos Aires, right away he gave signals that there was a change, above all in the way the Archbishop acted. He travelled by bus and by subway.
El lugar de culto de Jesús hoy, más que el templo, es la calle. Ahí fue aclamado. Ahí fue bendecido.
When Bergoglio was visiting the parishes, he was really listening. People started to feel that they were empowered, that they were important for the Church.
For Bergoglio, the popular devotions of the people put him in touch with their religious and cultural roots, and were a treasure to be valued and encouraged.
He would send his priests into the slums to work with the poor, and he would say to them, remember, you're not going to teach them, they are going to teach you. You know, intellectuals were very sniffy about the poor and said, oh, it's all kind of peasant superstition. He could see that the simple faith of ordinary people was a way that they connected with God.
Pero todas las noches yo veo en la Plaza de Mayo carritos cargados de cartones tirados por un chico.
Archbishop Bergoglio became a constant thorn in the side of the government, preaching a gospel favouring the poor against corruption and increasing poverty in the country.
He came to see that liberation theology had a serious point, which some people said was Marxist, but which he sees is completely in line with Catholic social teaching.
Most liberation theologians have come to agree that promotion of class warfare was a great mistake. But he did see that you had to take political action.
En esta ciudad hay hombres que lucran y se ceban con la carne del hermano, la carne de todos esos esclavos y esclavas, la carne que asumió Jesús es la misma y por la cual hoy Jesús está aquí, vale menos que la carne de una mascota. Y eso pasa en esta ciudad. Se cuida mejor a un perro que a estos esclavos nuestros, que se los patea, se los deshace. La gran ciudad de Buenos Aires.
He began to work with unions and cooperatives and self-help groups in the slums. Exactly the kind of thing he'd outlawed his own Jesuits from doing 2 decades earlier. He also began to understand the political insights of liberation theology, so that when in 2001 there was a massive crisis in Argentina, over half the population were below the poverty line. And Bergoglio then began to talk about how the economic structures had become corrupted and had become structures of sin.
Bergoglio learned from CELAM, the long tradition of the Conference of Latin American Bishops, who since the early 1960s developed a radical vision for the Church in South America that was focused primarily on the poor and their needs.
The South American Church gave to the Universal Church these ideas that poverty kills. It talks about social sin.
It's the only conference of bishops that has issued a document almost every single decade about how to connect social issues, social, political, economical issues with the gospel.
In 2001, Bergoglio was rewarded for his robust orthodoxy and solidarity with the poor by being elevated to cardinal by Pope John Paul II. In 2005, the Pope died. Despite a smear campaign against Bergoglio alleging his complicity with war crimes in Argentina, he was a serious candidate in the conclave that elected Cardinal Ratzinger as Pope. Shortly after his return home, Bergoglio was elected president of the Bishops' Conference in Argentina. But not all the bishops agreed with his leadership style.
There were sectors, of course, conservative sectors that wouldn't like that he wouldn't speak out against the gay marriage. He considered the one that was too progressive.
You had a group of bishops that were arch-conservatives and another group of bishops that were arch-liberal. And he had to hold them together. He managed to convince the other bishops, we don't need to agree in everything. Disagreement is part of the kingdom of God.
As Archbishop and President of the Bishops' Conference, Bergoglio experienced how the heavy hand of the Roman Curia sometimes weakened the authority of local bishops on the ground.
Bergoglio lived in this climate. Bergoglio suffered the hostility of Rome constantly. He was conscious that he had an authority above him who was the Pope, and many of the things that we discussed in Buenos Aires couldn't be changed because there was someone else above him.
I think he was frustrated by the interference of the Curia. He felt that the role of bishops was not really being fully respected. His great vision of Vatican II, of collegial responsibility, was being, he felt, undermined by the Vatican.
It is estimated that up to 30,000 people were killed or disappeared during Argentina's dirty war. Some 500 babies born in detention centres were illegally adopted. For years, the mothers and grandmothers of the disappeared marched outside government buildings looking for justice for crimes against their loved ones. But they never found support from Archbishop Bergoglio.
He never met the grandmothers. He never met the mothers of the disappeared. He never met with human rights organizations because he considered that that was a Marxist, progressive, disruptive part of Argentinian society.
When he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he had to keep together a very divided society, a society where people had been murdered and were murderers. This is in my view. He took the judgment that it was better if the past was not disturbed. Say as little as possible.
As part of Argentina's transition to democracy, the government set up a tribunal to investigate crimes committed during the Dirty War. In 2010, Cardinal Bergoglio gave evidence and was later accused by a questioning lawyer of being reticent and hesitant.
He felt he had to protect the whole of the church.
No los recuerdo porque eran gente que se presentaba y decía, bien, yo los conozco.
He didn't want the dirty linen to be washed in public. Exhuming the past would be counterproductive. But when you look at him on the TV footage saying those things, he looks like part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Remember that the government was not very friendly with Bergoglio, so they did all what they could to discredit him. And they couldn't find any single evidence.
At the end of 2014, Pope Francis met the president of the Mothers of the Disappeared, who said he has promised to open Vatican archives on the subject of the disappeared. Back in Rome, rumours of gay lobbies in the Curia, trouble at the Vatican Bank, and leaked papal documents proved too much for an ailing Pope Benedict. His shock resignation in 2013 was a wake-up call to the cardinals that the Church needed a firm hand at the helm. When the cardinals met before the conclave to discuss the problems facing the Church, the 76-year-old Bergoglio impressed them once again.
Bergoglio stood up and he made a speech, and it was the first speech which looked to the Church as an institution of mission. The Church has to remember that it's reflecting Christ, it has no light of its own. And when he made that speech, one cardinal turned to his neighbour and said, "This is the man, that's what we want."
The very first thing that he did when he got out onto the balcony of St. Peter's was bow to the people and say, "Please pray for me, please bless me before I give you my blessing." I mean, that in itself was just telling you, here's something very, very different.
When he came out on the balcony as Pope, one of the things that came to my mind was he got what he wanted.
Pope Francis very quickly set out his stall. He's about the gospel, not the Church. He's about compassion, not doctrine.
He has managed to touch something which leaders in the Church haven't managed to touch over the last 20, 30, 40 years. He's dispensed with a lot of certain traditions that he thought were excessive. The fact that he will not take these huge limousines when he travels, he wears his own black shoes, the fact that he carries his own briefcase.
Francis's decision to settle his hotel bill and not live in the Apostolic Palace were early signals of how he wanted to govern the Church and be perceived as Pope. He wants to be in control of what he does and whom he meets.
He tells me that the Pope's apartments is a very big place with a very small door. In Santa Marta I have a small place, but the door is open.
When you see the Pope getting up and getting his own breakfast, that says something to you. This mystique about the Pope being up there and a holy man, he's just one of us.
He's not an emperor, he's a normal pastor, and he's changing everything.
He shocked Vatican purists when he washed the feet of a Muslim female prisoner on Holy Thursday. His off-the-cuff comments can swing both ways. An in-flight remark about gay people set a whole new tone to the papacy.
Si una persona è gay e cerca il Signore e ha buona volontà, ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
When he said, "Who am I to judge a gay person?" so many young gay Christians were able to breathe and feel themselves understood.
He's making these big, audacious gestures, which a lot of people in Rome are very uncomfortable about.
There's really just a growing confusion about what the church really teaches. You can't have this dichotomy between doctrine and the discipline by which we're disposed to follow him.
In just 2 years, Pope Francis has become a moral voice for a troubled world. He has personally intervened to re-establish relations between Cuba and the United States. And he had the leaders of Palestine and Israel come to the Vatican to pray together for peace in the Middle East. In November 2013, Pope Francis published his first document, The Joy of the Gospel. It's his manifesto and encapsulates a new departure.
The Church must stop just looking at itself, and it must go to what he calls the periphery, the poor, the people that are left out, to abandon the centre of power, the centre of privilege.
He has changed tone, and he has created space for voices to speak. People are going to push the envelope on ideas where they may very well challenge elements of the magisterium.
Certainly I've seen huge change in his pastoral outlook. In his speeches denouncing injustices and those who oppress the poor. This was something new, and I was pleasantly surprised by it. Because that's not the Bergoglio I knew.
It's a new moment that we're living in. There is continuity with the past, but a break with the immediate past.
On his election, the new Pope called his predecessor. Today they met for the first time as past and present popes.
One cardinal said to me, he's on the same team as Benedict, he just kicks the ball in a different direction.
Pope Benedict and Pope Francis are by formation and temperament very different people. Benedict is an academic, he's a thinker, whereas Pope Francis is somebody who learns on the streets. Central to his theology is an engagement with people. He's brought back strongly the phrase, the people of God. Hasn't appeared much in the last 20 years.
He has loosened the awful intellectual clamp that was imposed for years under John Paul and Benedict. People were afraid of being silenced. And I think what Francis has done is given us back the Church of Vatican II. A big, noisy church where people are going to fall in and out with one another.
I think what Pope Francis wants to do is to have a church which is less controlling, because he believes that the Holy Spirit is blow where it will.
Una curia che non si autocritica, che non si aggiorna, che non cerca di migliorarsi, è un corpo infermo.
Pope Francis has begun a process to create new, more transparent and efficient structures in the Roman Curia. But he also wants to radically change the mindset in the Vatican.
What he thinks and always thought is that the Roman Curia should be at the service of those of us in the trenches, because they're in an office and you can't see reality from an office.
The new Pope's pioneering Council of 9 Cardinals began implementing change.
He has set up a council of 9 cardinals from all around the world, and they are all known as maverick critics of the Vatican. This council is the most important development in church governance for 10 centuries.
Reforming the Curia is a meaningless exercise unless you reform church governance. That means that there has to be a decision-making body working with the Pope. It's supposed to be about decision-making, not advising, not collaborating with, not being asked your opinion, but being directly involved in governance.
Does Pope Francis have such a decision-making body in mind? It's clear that he wants a very different kind of power sharing between himself and the world's bishops. Up to now, it has been the Pope and the Curia who have governed the whole Church from Rome.
He's telling the bishops, I'm ruling the church with you. Don't expect me to do everything for your church.
He's saying the church needs to be much more open. We need to have left-wing cardinals and right-wing cardinals. He wants all of the church to take part in decision-making.
That isn't the way church doctrine is formulated, and that's not the way church discipline is formulated. The church is not a democracy. The church is not about revolutions.
The first leg of the recent Synod on the Family showed signs of a new approach by Pope Francis, with consultations from Catholics at the grassroots and open debate on issues where bishops up to now feared to speak their minds.
But the Pope's conciliatory comments on gays and also on atheism have alienated conservatives.
This talk about finding good elements in homosexual acts, that simply is a contradiction for us. Yes, of course there are good qualities in the individuals, but the acts themselves are disordered.
While some liberals would like him to spell out where he stands on issues such as contraception, married clergy and the role of women.
There is opposition for every change. So, I mean, I do expect when he makes any change, there will be opposition.
Some were very upset and disturbed that the cardinals were arguing in public. Oh, most of us are saying, well, isn't that what a debate is about? You try winning people with your arguments.
And one Vatican watcher is pleased that the Pope urged the Synod to debate controversial issues.
Some cardinals wanted to limit the debate. They want some issues off the table. We don't want to talk about welcoming gays and lesbians. We don't want to talk about giving communion to divorced and remarried Catholics. As a matter of fact,
the Pope is not particularly interested in conveying doctrine. He's interested in conveying the message of the gospel, and the prime message is being love and inclusion. That is not part of the traditionalists' vision, in which they've got from previous popes.
If he really wants to deal with a church that was being run into the ground, essentially, by his predecessors, he does have to move smartly. The Pope is perfectly entitled to create a fully collegial decision-making body along with him. That would be truly radical.
Pope Francis spoke about the need to develop a new theology of woman. Many are waiting to see what he's going to do to include women in meaningful roles in ministry and governance in the Church.
The biggest challenge that the Pope faces is how he is to give voice and authority to women.
There is a blind side here that leaves so many really good, gentlemanly, decent men like Francis still carrying a residual element of misogyny that closes them off to the dangers of not dealing with this issue. I don't think that he gets it, or that anybody around him fully understands. Why would they? You know, they're all clerical male celibates who are just used to women kissing their hems, handing them their meals, polishing their tables.
I would personally hope that women would be very soon ordained deacons so that they could preach and have a public voice. But I think that Pope Francis is looking for something more radical than that.
And some are watching closely to see what structures he will put in place to empower lay people in the day-to-day life of the Church and the Vatican.
That was the church that we were promised in Vatican II, the Church of the people of God, the open church where the voice of the laity and the spirituality of the laity was on the same level as that of priests and bishops. The old hierarchical church was to be flattened.
He wants the bishops to give responsibility to the people. And I think that's a very important part of Pope Francis's spirituality, daring not to be in control.
Ironically, while Pope Francis has been looking to the peripheries and decentralising the Church, things seem, if anything, to be becoming more centred on him.
The paradox about Francis is that he wants to decentralise the Church, and yet he's an incredibly centralising person himself.
If you're going to make change and it's going to stick, you've got to put structures into place that are going to make those changes carry through, regardless of who's in the seat.
But can Pope Francis succeed when his predecessor failed to handle the internal power struggles within the Roman Curia?
He can deal with the politics of the Vatican with his little finger.
I think he's very Ignatian, and it helps him not only in his interior life, but also in his way of governing.
Perhaps what the story of Jorge Mario Bergoglio tells us is that he is the man who can revolutionize the Church at this time.
For him, power is service. If you have power, you have the capacity to serve and to improve people's life. This is at the very root of the gospel.
He doesn't strike me as a man with a plan, because he's the kind of man who trusts in God.
He's a man of great simplicity, but that hides a story of great complexity. The great theme of the story is that he's a man who has overcome his weaknesses.
Pope Francis knows what it's like to rule by diktat and alienate people. He had the humility to change from a divisive authoritarian leader into a smiling, collaborative pope who wants to connect with everyone, particularly the outcast.
I can only judge Pope Francis on the actions he takes as Pope, and I like what I see.
He has vision, ambition, and political savvy, but has learned to acknowledge his failures and put God first. In the process, it is the sinner who is saving the Church.